I was regarded at Harvard Business School as being a communist.
A brief is setting out your ambition. The brief from the Pope was make them believe.
This one is a bit of a mystery still, when my first tweet is going to happen.
It takes the same amount of energy to try and do something great as it does to justify something average.
If I was a CMO and I'd give them a 3-word brief, make us famous.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 22nd episode of WFA's Better Marketing Podcast. And what better way to end the year by looking to next year? And we're going to be doing that in the company of the man absolutely best qualified, because he is the editor of The Economist, The World Ahead. He's the deputy editor of The Economist. He's a writer of history books, 7 in total, with some fabulous titles: A History of the World in 6 Glasses, An Edible History of Humanity. But it's Tom Standage. Tom, hello and welcome. How are you?
Very well. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Good. Well, listen, got to pack lots of stuff in here. And can we start by you telling us a little bit about your journey? A really interesting one, studying engineering and computer science, and now working for The Economist. And you use all sorts of historical analogies to bring things to life, and you bring in your science as well. So tell us how you got where you are, and share your story, please.
Yeah, no, I can't remember who said life is lived forward but understood backwards, and I think that's exactly right in my case. So I went to university in the late 80s because I wanted to study AI, and I wanted to build robots and AIs. I'd read lots of science fiction, and unfortunately, that, if you look back at the history of AI, that was the period known as one of the winters in AI, and so I was very disappointed that actually this technology didn't really work. And so I did my degree, which was in engineering and computer science, and around that time, I started to, send emails to people, because that was one of the things we had to do in the computer lab. We had computers and networks, and I discovered I could send emails to my girlfriend in London because the internet. And so when I graduated, the internet was my sort of ticket into journalism. I wasn't going to go and build AIs. Instead, I went and discovered that the press really didn't have people who knew about the internet, and so I started writing on a freelance basis. I ended up at The Guardian for a year, and then at The Telegraph for 2 years, writing about the internet and what was going to happen. And then I moved to The Economist in 1998, and I've been there ever since. And I suppose what's been useful is having a broad grounding in physical sciences and in computer science. I've applied that primarily in science journalism and technology journalism, but I have sort of branched out. And more broadly, going back to the science fiction and the AI, science fiction is a way of figuring out what the future looks like. The technology is one of the big influences on what the future looks like. And really what I'm interested in is what the future looks like. And I think The Economist is one of the best places in the world to try and figure that out, because I get to meet the smartest people in the world who are trying to create the future. And also there are other big factors, geopolitical, economic forces that also shape the future, and where better to learn about those than at The Economist. But then I've also, over the course of my career, also written several history books where I've tried to draw on the history of science and the history of technology to work out what lessons that might have for the future. So I end up sort of looking at the future from 3 directions: from the present as a journalist, because you can go to the parts of the world where you can see the future already happening, whether that's going and riding in a self-driving car, or going to Tokyo in 2001 to see the phones they had then, which had cameras and color screens, and you could download apps, and that was what was coming for the rest of us, but that they had it in Japan first. So there's the sort of visiting the edge cases of the future that are present today. So that's the journalism piece of it. And then the reading the sci-fi is the future part of it, reading the imagined futures, and then mining the past for lessons about the future is what I do in my books. And so sort of inevitably, or it seems in retrospect, I've ended up, one of the many things I do at The Economist is editing our annual, The World Ahead, which is us trying to work out what the future might look like. And so I spend every year between May and October sort of corralling our internal and external experts to come up with their view, and that's what we've just published, our view of what's going to happen next year. So yes, future gazing, but sort of from multiple perspectives has been where I've landed.
And this is the first, but because this is the WFA, we're going to constantly be doing this. Here it is. Fantastic
Excellent.
read,
Let's
by the
both
way.
brandish it as much as possible. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly. But you know what? Just to kind of build on that, I'm fascinated by the prediction process. I mean, how do you set about deciding what might happen? And I guess I'm vaguely worried that it's all a science fiction thing. But
Well, it's
but
lots
tell
of
us
things
more.
from lots of directions. Yeah. So I suppose, I mean, the thing about science fiction is sort of taking a science fiction. This isn't really about the future. It's invariably actually about the present. So there's lots of really interesting of science fiction at the moment that's about gender identity. For example, there's lots of interesting Chinese science fiction, and the reason people are interested in this is because those are issues that society is paying much more attention to. So that reflects itself in stories about spaceships in the future and so on. When it comes to predicting what we think is going to happen the following year, we have multiple groups of people and sort of multiple processes that all happen, and I have to sort of draw them all together. The starting point is we have a meeting in May, and it used to be, and I think it will be again next year, it used to be on a Monday afternoon, lots of coffee and lots of tea and lots of sticky buns, and everyone would have a massive sugar and caffeine rush, and I would go around the table of all our editors and say, what do you think we should be watching out for next year? Who are interesting people to watch? Who should we invite to write for us? What are the trends that you can see? And if you put them on the spot like that, they come up with some interesting ideas, but they also give each other interesting ideas. And so that's the sort of beginning of the process. And that's more or less fiction at that point, because it's still May, and we really don't know what's going to happen the following year. But we start to sort of explore some themes and look at some emerging trends. And essentially, the writers then sort of modify what they're planning to write about. Sometimes they change it completely, sometimes they refine it over the course of the next few months, and then they actually have to send me the articles in September. At the same time, we're looking at the external experts, who are the right people to ask each year. This year we have, as usual, a wide range of people. We have Sal Khan, the founder of Khan Academy. We have Eric Adams, the mayor of New York. We have Nicola Sturgeon. We have Brian Eno. So we have people from the arts, from politics, from business. We have Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, who has this very interesting Bridgetown initiative, which is a way of funding climate adaptation in the emerging world. So we have a range of people, and we ask them. We start sending letters out in sort of June, trying to get people to say yes. Then we also have our colleagues at the Economist Intelligence Unit, and that's the B2B arm of the Economist Group, and they make forecasts about GDP, economic factors in different countries. So they produce a section in the middle of this publication where they have forecasts for about 90 countries and 15 industries, and that's something that the EIU does anyway. So essentially you get this sort of very potted forecast from the EIU for particular countries and particular industries. And then the final piece of the puzzle is the super forecasting team at Good Judgment. So super forecasting is a method developed by an American academic called Philip Tetlock, and the US government had a geopolitics forecasting competition, and the first year they held it, the super forecasters won by a huge margin, and everyone thought, oh, it must be a fluke. So they held it again the next year, and the super forecasters won again by a huge margin. So they stopped having the competition and just said, look, whatever they're doing is obviously the best thing. And we're very lucky that every year we get to ask the super forecasting team 10 questions, and they give us these sort of, very, very precise predictions about things. And like, how likely is it that Vladimir Putin will be ousted before the 1st of October 2023? And they say 9%. And, you can take that with a pinch of salt. But I mean, they do have a very good track record. And one of the things I have to do as editor of The World Ahead is I have to assess how well they did each year, but also how well we did collectively. I have to write an article about what we got right and what we got wrong. Anyway, the main thing is that all of these sources of predictions for next year start landing on my desk, and I then have to edit everything and make sort of judgments on where they disagree, what we're going to do. And then I synthesize it all into my top 10, and I have an editor's letter at the beginning that says, here are the main themes that I can see sort of running through all of this. So if you just want a sort of high-level view, here are the top 10 trends. So it's a multi-month long process. It means that by now, here we are in December, actually since about October, I have felt like I am in 2023. It doesn't feel like the future anymore, and I'm sort of already starting to think about 2024. So it's slightly weird.
I suppose, can I ask you a strange question? What's the worst prediction you've ever made, and what have you got horrendously wrong along the way? We'll obviously come to what you've got right.
Actually, the mistakes tend to be not predicting things. so we didn't predict that the pandemic would happen. So we missed one of the horsemen of the apocalypse. And COVID-19 is only just called COVID-19 and not COVID-20 because they only just figured it out at the end of 2019. A few weeks after we'd gone to press. So I don't think we could have foreseen that one. I mean, we have had articles in the past about what people call disease X, which is what people used to call, the pandemic that will come, because we had quite a long period there where we hadn't had a global pandemic. And that's actually quite surprising in retrospect because we've got unprecedented levels of interconnectivity, global travel, and so on. So actually, lots of people, Bill Gates most famously, but lots of people in public health were saying we are going to have a pandemic at some point. We need to be prepared for it. The British government actually had a very good pandemic preparedness plan. It just completely ignored it when the pandemic arrived. Singapore, however, took it and said, "Thank you very much. We'll have that." This year, we did not predict that we did not predict the Russian invasion of Ukraine. When we went to press in November of 2021, there were people saying this build-up of forces has happened before. Is this just the same? Is it the usual putting pressure on countries around Russia? The fact that they were all still there at the end of December was extremely suggestive that something different was going to happen this time. And of course, by January it was pretty clear. So that's the big thing we missed, and that meant that we also sort of compounded another thing. We in retrospect weren't gloomy enough about inflation. In last year's issue, we said there would be inflation in 2022, but at the time there was a general view that it would sort of work its way through the system because it was the current wave of inflation started as a side effect of the pandemic, and it's just been magnified by the war because the obviously the increase in energy prices and so forth, and the disruption to supply chains that's caused. So that has also meant that we weren't ringing the alarm bells loudly enough about inflation because it's become a much bigger problem because of the war in Ukraine, which means that inflation will be higher for longer and recessions will be deeper next year than they otherwise would have been.
Can I ask you, Tom, now, I mean, obviously The Economist is an unashamedly proud British publication. How do you remain empathetic to the world view and balance it? Because this has been a horrendous year in Britain. In other bits of the world, different. I mean, how do you maintain?
Yeah, we are based in Britain, but I don't think we're sort of proudly British. We don't, unlike I've worked for British newspapers, and when you work at the Daily Telegraph, a PR person might ring you up and say, "Can I sell you a great story about how a feisty British startup is taking on the Chinese at their own game," or whatever, or that's a great story for the Daily Telegraph, which has got to be Britain is best, Britain wins at everything is wonderful. That's not a story for the Economist. The Economist is based in Britain but has a global perspective. In fact, Charles Moore, former editor of the Daily Telegraph, once accused the Economist of being childless journalism because it's so sort of according to the OECD this, and I call it the view from the moon. And people say that it's the in-house journal of the citizens of nowhere, the people who fly around in aeroplanes and go to Davos and aren't actually rooted in any particular country. So those are all the sort of uncharitable ways of looking at it. But I think really what it is that The Economist, what we're unashamedly about is defending sort of classical 19th century liberal values. So freedom, free people, free trade, free markets, that sort of approach. And that's what The Economist was founded to campaign for in 1843, and that's what we still campaign for. And we're very open about that being our bias. That does not align with either left or right-wing politics. It means we tend to agree with the right on economics and the left on social matters. And so, we've supported Republicans and Democrats for president. We've supported, all three of the main parties in the UK. And clearly, as a paper founded in the interest of free trade, we thought Brexit was a stupid idea right from the start, because essentially Brexit is the only example in history of a country imposing trade sanctions on itself. That's what we've done by Brexiting. The negotiation with Europe was the first trade negotiation in history about making the terms of trade worse, which is extraordinary because normally you have trade negotiations, you're trying to open up new markets and take away friction. We're trying to add friction and close markets, and you've seen what the result is. So if you look at the economic situation now, lots of countries, particularly in the West, have got inflation as a result of the pandemic. So we had disrupted supply chains, we had pandemic stimulus, which in some cases went a bit too too far and has caused this inflation. That's been amplified by the war. In Europe, you've then got this added complexity that we have, because of the dependence on Russian gas, much, much higher energy prices. So you have this additional energy shock, which you don't have in the US to the same extent. And then in Britain, we've got the post-pandemic inflation plus the energy shock plus the impact of Brexit, which is why we are going to have the worst recession. And it's going to go on. It's probably already begun, actually. But that's the difficulty that we already had a long term even before Brexit, even before the pandemic, even before the energy shock of the war. We already had a big problem, which is that we've had bad productivity growth since the global financial crisis, the sick man of Europe. Investment then, as soon as the Brexit vote happened, inward investment into Britain sort of basically came to a halt. Why would you build a car factory in Britain now? I mean, you'd be mad, because you don't know what the terms of trade are going to be with the rest of the world. You don't know what the incentives are. Everything's up for grabs. There's a new prime minister every 5 minutes. So, of course, that means that foreign companies are not interested in investing in Britain in the way they were in the past, and it's been a disaster. And the realization seems to have dawned. The British public now consistently says that they think Brexit was a mistake in polls, and the margin of people who say that gets bigger. But it was crazy all along. It never made any sense. Of course, even the people who called for Brexit are saying this is a disaster because that's not the Brexit they wanted. This is a very similar argument to communism is a great idea. It just hasn't been done properly yet. But it's never been done properly, and lots of people have tried it there's only one country trying Brexit and it's not working. But of course, all of the Brexit, this isn't the Brexit I wanted. Oh, well, I would have done it a totally different way, etc., etc. Anyway, but we have shot ourselves in the foot, amputated the wrong leg, set ourselves on fire, and imposed trade sanctions on ourselves here. It's there is no upside to this. There is no Brexit dividend. It's just disaster.
Yes, no, I am as passionate as you about that, but we'll come back later, perhaps. I think we also share being optimists, and you might wonder
exactly.
why.
I think at the same time, I like to think you have to be realist, but I mean, this is undoubtedly a bad thing. But there are areas in the current gloom. There are three particular silver linings, in fact, that I highlight for next year. So I think that is something we can talk about.
Good. Well, can I bring us closer to home, though, to the world of marketing? and how should we as marketeers think about the future and get better at predicting it? Because actually, marketing is often myopic in thinking about future planning. What would you recommend? Your friend of the WFA, long-time friend, Tom, you must have observed what marketeers are up to. So what are your thoughts?
It looks to me like a lot of marketing involves stealing ideas from other people. This idea worked for them, or I saw this on YouTube, so let's do that. I think you could cast the net a bit more widely than that, and I think that's the crucial ingredient if you're trying to generate new ideas about the future, or indeed about anything else. Look as widely as possible, have as many perspectives as possible. So you want, diversity of viewpoint. That often means, it does mean you need a diversity of people. But main thing is to sort of look outside your world. I suppose the Economist world is the world. I mean, it's the universe. So we're kind of quite used to scavenging across all fields, across politics, across business, across culture, across technology, for anything interesting, because that's our job, is to find interesting stuff. But I think, in any field, who was it who said we are enriched only by exploring fields other than our own? So looking for those unexpected, and this is what I've tried to do in my career, the using history to inform journalism, for example. I'm playing with the new ChatGPT AI right now. One of the fun things to get that to do is to ask it to generate silly ideas. I was at the Most Contagious event recently, and there was a very interesting talk there about the use of generative AI in the creative process, mainly because it comes up with stuff you wouldn't have come up with. In fact, we used one of these systems to generate our first AI generated cover in 2022. And what was interesting about that was we did that and we put it on the cover, but subsequently a couple of other covers we've been, our creative team, the people who do our covers, they've said, why don't we try putting some of these prompts into that system and see what it comes up with? And sometimes it actually comes up with ideas. We don't use the actual imagery, but we go, oh, that's interesting. There was one I remember where we put in a prompt and it came up with a skyline of a city that was also a bar chart. And we thought, oh, that's really clever. So it was a sort of visual joke because it was both those things at the same time. So I think that's that's another better way of doing it. I'm not saying just use AI for everything. I'm just saying be open to new approaches, new tools from wherever they are, and you really can't go wrong. You can't have too rich and too weird a mix of ideas. So just read as much as possible and absorb as much as possible from other fields, rather than being quite inward looking and saying they won an award for a campaign last year that did that. Let's do our version of that. Yeah. That's a lot of marketing to me as an outsider looks like that.
Yes, I mean, I've always thought the key skill of a marketeer is curiosity in its full breadth, and indeed an understanding that in the world there's not much originality. There's fantastic plagiarism, and you can take a great idea from a rock band and turn it into a marketing idea. It doesn't just have to be marketing. Anyway, can I also ask you about what marketeers can expect more of in the future? I mean, I'm fascinated the lack of regulation around the digital platforms as an example of what hasn't happened. Do you think that's coming? What do you think about regulation we're likely to see? What do you think about tech and what tech is going to increasingly be able to do? And indeed AI and all of that, of course, impacts consumer behaviour. That's about 7 questions in one.
Yeah, no, but I can see the kind of general area of the map. I don't think there is regulation. I mean, GDPR, we've all had to get used to that. We've got sort of creeping GDPR in America, which is, I would agree, under-regulated. An awful lot of the problems we have with the big tech platforms arise from the fact that the US doesn't have privacy regulation in the way that other parts of the world, notably Europe, does. And so it is a bit of a free-for-all on personal data. I think that is something that, I mean, there are very few things that Republicans and Democrats agree on, but one of them is that they'd like to take big tech down a peg or two. And I think the area where you might see that, and you might actually see some bipartisan action, the most likely area is protecting the children, because that goes down really well with everybody. And all politicians have to say they're looking out for the children. The other area where Republicans and Democrats agree is that they want to be tough on China. And what's the intersection of protecting the children and being tough on China? It's regulating TikTok. And so I think that's the thing, that's the area to look at. I think we could see laws in the US. And we're seeing state level laws. So the CCPA in California is basically a copy and paste of GDPR for California, and that's having ripple effects. It means that we're having to conform to that as well around the world. Anyone who wants to have websites that pop up in California and don't just say, sorry, we can't serve you because we're in California. You'd be mad to do that, right? California would be one of the biggest economies in the world if it was a separate country. So I think there is actually regulation. It's a patchwork. There's more of it in some places than others. That makes life hard, as we all know. Then you've also got the sort of pseudo-regulation of the platforms themselves changing the rules. Most famously, Apple changing its rules, which has affected Facebook most obviously. And then you've got the fact that the way that the platforms operate is changing. And so we're going from, we're moving more and more towards algorithmic curation, and that's again why TikTok is so interesting. And this is what the social platforms that have been very important players in digital marketing are becoming less important, because actually getting stuff from your friends is giving way to getting stuff from an algorithm that is actually very good at guessing what you'd like. So this is a lot to keep up with, and it means you constantly have to change what you're doing, which is what makes it fun, but is also what makes it difficult. So yeah, I think we are going to see regulation. It's most likely to be in those sorts of areas, and that's what I would be keeping an eye on.
And what about the tech sector itself? Do you think, obviously, there's been a proliferation of scandals? Has it lost its luster of the glory days for Meta? Are they finished?
I think there's various things going on. I think crypto is sort of its own thing. Crypto is essentially, a casino at best. And frankly, it's worse than a casino, because a casino, the odds are stacked against you and you'll probably lose money. Crypto's like a casino where even if you win, the house sometimes steals your money and runs off with it to the Bahamas anyway. So I've had nothing to do with it. And I've always thought it was, deeply pointless. Cryptocurrencies don't make any sense. They're bad as money on all of the kind of usual things that you expect money to do. And I mean, as a computer scientist, I do think the basic idea of blockchain is very clever. It's a clever sort of magic trick, which is that we're used to the idea that physical objects are hard to duplicate. So if you've got a Ferrari, I can't copy and paste your Ferrari. That's not possible. But if you've got an audio file or a music file or something like that, or a photo, I can duplicate that digital file very easily. So we're used to the idea that digital is easy to copy and physical is hard to copy. And what blockchain does is it makes it possible to have unique digital objects that can't be copied, and that is a clever trick, and there are potentially uses that people might come up with that at some point in the future. I don't know, I mean, nobody has yet. The obvious thing to do is make coins, because you want coins to not be copyable, and so that's why we've had cryptocurrencies, and then we've had NFTs as well, which are sort of, certificates of, they're like receipts really. Here's a receipt that says you own a thing, but the problem is that if you're going to, there isn't a use case that most people want for this. There's just been speculation, and we haven't really got a case for mass adoption of this technology. And even if we did, people would have to trust it, which I don't think they do at the moment. So I think that's a bit of a special case. I think what's happening at Meta is also something of a special case. That's a company that has been overtaken by, and this is what, I just think, stepping back a bit, this is what tends to happen with big tech companies that look absolutely impregnable. People were saying, oh, Facebook's too powerful, it owns Instagram, it owns WhatsApp, we need to break them up, there needs to be regulation, get the antitrust people in. Nothing has happened on that front. And now, actually, Facebook seems to be sort of crumbling, imploding on its own, because it's got the wrong technology. It's based on social networks, not on algorithms. It's trying to retrofit that into its platforms, but it's not going terribly well. And so now it's betting, on the metaverse instead. But I think that's a problem specific to that company. But there is this broader point. I think this does keep happening, which is that a big company comes along and we think, well, this scary looking tech firm will never ever be displaced, and then actually technology moves on, and that's usually that's what keeps tech executives awake at night, the worry that they'll miss the next big thing. That's actually a much bigger concern than regulation is in practice. Yeah. So I think the fact that we are less enamored with the tech bro culture is a good thing. I think that things have gone a bit too far in that direction, and the sort of, I'm here from the tech industry and I'm here to help. That was a sort of, that was a terrifying, that was essentially their position. So the sort of messiah complex that we see among some of these tech people, and Elon Musk is the best example. And I know this problem as an engineer, but I've also written about it as a journalist. Engineers think everything is an engineering problem. I mean, everyone thinks everything is there. So risk analysis, people think everything is a risk analysis problem, and insurers think everything is an insurance problem. Marketers think, well, everything's a marketing problem. And this company can solve all its problems if it just has the right marketing campaign, or just has the right technology, or just has the right risk analysis approach. And so that, it's classic. I've got a hammer. Where are the nails? And but I think we have had a sort of messiah complex in a lot of tech. I remember seeing Mark Zuckerberg, before it all kind of went wrong for Facebook, talking about how Facebook was going to lead to world peace because it was going to connect everyone and all this kind of stuff. And I know from history, this is what people said about telegraphs. When the first transatlantic telegraphs were set up, people said, oh, this is going to lead to world peace because wars are caused by a lack of communication. Actually, no, they're not, but never mind. But that's what, engineers always think, that, I'm going to build this network and it's going to lead to world peace. Aeroplanes were also going to lead to world peace, by the way, because we'd all be able to fly around the world and see we were all just the same. And therefore there wouldn't be wars. And also, if there was a war, you could just drop bombs on the army from the aeroplane, and therefore armies would be obsolete. Therefore wars wouldn't happen. So we just keep getting these same patterns. And so we had a particular burst of sort of techno-optimism or sort of techno-messiah, complex. So I think it's good that the pendulum has swung back a bit. And I think I think technology I'm by and large optimistic about technology's ability to solve our problems, and most importantly, climate change. I still think that's the case, but I don't think we need the sort of hero engineer cult quite as much as we've had it lately.
No, and I think I've always said the shiny new glitters, but you should always be suspicious of it. But I think one thing, just to return, we touched on it very briefly, despite all of this, we share being optimists. I mean, in your case, if you look at the world now, what's going on with climate change, with Russia and war and the education levels, the polarised politics, stagflation, inflation and so on, what reasons have we got to be cheerful and optimistic, Tom?
Okay, here are three. Here are three. The first is that the war in Ukraine, weirdly, is the best thing that's ever happened in the fight against climate change, because European countries never want to depend on Russian gas again. So they are not buying it, and they are accelerating their deployment of renewables. Now, you can't actually see that in the numbers just yet, because it takes a minimum of 2 years to get new wind and solar online. So in practice, what we're seeing this year is a lot more burning of coal. But even there, the amount by which emissions have gone up globally is only about 1% this year. So it's a lot less than you would have expected. And what we're seeing is European countries are using record levels of renewables this year. And many of them have brought forward their targets for what fraction of their electricity they expect to come from renewables by 2030. In many cases, they've raised their targets to 100% by 2030. Yep. The Labour Party in Britain is talking about Britain being the first net zero country by 2030. I think that is a brilliant target. I think it's totally doable, particularly because we've got lots and lots of very windy coasts. So we just do a massive amount of wind. Yep. I think that's a great idea. I think that's a vote winner as well. I think it's a very good idea. It's interesting that there's now starting to be a debate about, given the enthusiasm that suddenly everybody has for renewables, for geopolitical and economic reasons, they're cheaper than oil and you don't have to buy hydrocarbons from autocrats. This is great news, but so much money is now being thrown at this that we saw that tensions between Europe and America over whether these subsidies that they're giving their renewables industries are fair. So America has this very generous scheme for subsidizing electric cars, and Europe doesn't like it because the cars have to have been made in America. But I think this is great. This is a great problem to have, that there's so much money is being pumped into renewables and electric cars and battery factories and hydrogen, that politicians are arguing about whether the enormous amounts of money being pumped into these things is fair or not. That's great. That's progress. So Fatih Birol, the head of the International Energy Agency, says that the war in Ukraine is a turning point in the history of energy that will accelerate the clean energy transition, and I think that's exactly right. So there's cause for optimism there, even though we've got this awful conflict in the biggest land war in Europe in 1945. So that's number one. Number two is the conflict has brought together the Western alliance. It's reminded us why we have NATO and why we have the EU. Democracy doesn't just defend itself. Peace doesn't happen on its own. And we've kind of been taking it for granted for decades, because we had NATO and we had the EU, and we were like, well, look, we don't have wars anymore. It's all fine. And Donald Trump was saying, America doesn't need NATO anymore, and we left the EU because obviously we don't need the EU. I think we do, but never mind. And so this is very, very good, because it's reminded everybody, that actually we do stand for democracy. We do stand for a whole bunch of Western sort of democratic values. So that has unified the West. Actually, the gap between the West and the rest has got bigger as a result. Most people in the world live in countries that either abstained or supported Russia in UN votes. So I'm not saying that this is the end of history, Fukuyama style again, but there is actually quite a big flavour of the end of history coming back, because the third silver lining is the total discrediting of the Chinese model, which we've seen this year. So for years people have said, well, the Chinese model, and this is an argument that you've seen autocrats around the world arguing, we're going to do Chinese style development, and this is where people have fewer rights, but the state protects them and they get faster economic growth. So actually they're happy with that deal because they get richer. And this is totally broken down in China. It's now being outgrown by India, which is a democracy, and the state in China cannot protect its people from Omicron because its misguided policies of only using their own vaccines that don't work very well and not even deploying them very widely, is leading to unrest and a slowdown in growth. Also, next year, India's population is going to overtake China's. China's population is going to start to shrink, and the Chinese property market is already that's in a mess. That's definitely peaked. People are now saying that China's economy will never overtake America's in size. And I think the last 10 years, it's been assumed, the last 15 years, that sooner or later, China would overtake America to become the world's biggest economy. That may now not happen. The rapid period of growth that China had looks like it's come to an end. So that's bad in a lot of ways. It slows down global growth. China was supporting development and infrastructure in a lot of developing countries. So I'm not saying there are no downsides to this, but the main thing it does is it takes away the idea that there was an alternative to sort of Western-style democratic capitalism, which isn't just restricted to the West. You get it in Taiwan, you get it in Japan, you get it in South Korea, the global West, as it's sometimes called. And the idea that China was an alternative to that is completely gone, and I think that's good. So three silver linings amid the current turmoil, and I think those are all good news.
And are they all to be found in this publication, Tom?
By an amazing coincidence, you will find evidence for all of these things.
Right.
Yes, on the hydrogen transition. We don't actually have a piece that draws together the three silver linings, but those are the three silver linings that you will find if you read this. So yes, that's a cause for optimism. But I'm trying to be realistic here because there's lots of cause for gloom as well next year. We are going to have recessions. The war is probably going to continue for the whole of next year. But I think we need to be. I think we also need to be aware of and alive to the upsides that are in the current situation as well.
Yeah, and I think I like to think of myself as an informed optimist. So it's not stupidity, but there's also that simple truth. And one of the ex-global marketers of the year had a wonderful soundbite, which is miserable people get miserable results. And if you're positive about stuff, you can usually find your way to solve problems. So for that reason,
I think that's right. Being open to ideas and being curious, I think, is important. The other thing is just looking at the long run of history. Technology consistently surprises us on the upside with what it can do. Sometimes it surprises us, in ways we don't want. But by and large, I think the way we solve the climate crisis is I think it's probably that. These other factors, I don't think political action does it. I think the fact that we now have good geopolitical reasons and good economic reasons to adopt renewables, that's actually cheap. Let's have cheap electric cars. We've already got cheap solar. I think technological progress is most likely to solve that problem, rather than political action, which seems to be really, really difficult. So, that's what I'm pinning my hopes on. But if you look at the big technological transformations that have happened in the past, we avoided the Malthusian trap in the 1790s by adopting steam, and then obviously that caused the climate change problem, which we've now got to fix with a whole load of other technology. But this is how it works.
Good. And we've usually got the imagination and the creativity to solve those problems. So
so we've got more brains. What was it? Matt Ridley says, innovation is ideas having sex. You've got more, and in fact, there is emerging. There's quite a lot of evidence that the rate of innovation that you get. Why did it take so long for, say, the steam engine to emerge in the 17th century? Because people have been kicking their idea around since the ancient Greeks. But why did it take so long? One of the factors is when you've got a smaller population, you've got fewer people trying things. And the more people you've got in the world, the more people you've got coming up with ideas, the more other people they can talk to. In fact, the square of the number of people they can talk to. And then you've got things like the internet and better literacy. And so it's just a brilliant environment for people to have new ideas and make new things happen in whatever field. Yeah. But people say, technological innovation has come to an end and look at what's happened. Nothing's really been invented lately. And I think that's completely wrong. I think that's true if you define technology quite narrowly, but there's lots of exciting things going on. Also, look at what's happening with AI at the moment. I mean, it really is extraordinary how quickly that's progressing. So, I'm not a gloomy person who says nothing new has been invented since the smartphone. I think there's lots of interesting stuff going on in lots of fields.
I agree with that. And finally, Tom, I understand that you play the drums and you're in a band.
Yeah.
Sebastopol, I think it's the name.
Yeah, so I'm in a band. It's called Sebastopol. Look us up on Spotify. Sebastopol is, of course, a port in Crimea. The band has been called that for more than a decade, but so it's because of the guitar tuning. So after the first Crimean War, there was a popular song called. So this was in the 1850s. A popular song called "The Siege of Sebastopol," and or Sevastopol, I think it was spelt. And it uses a particular guitar tuning, and our guitarist exclusively uses that guitar tuning, and that's why the band is called what it is. I play in another band at work as well, and this is about bringing your whole self to work. We have a jazz band at the Economist called the Invisible Hands, and we haven't been able to play together for many years, obviously because of the plague. So we are just getting ready to play at our end of year Christmas party, which is great fun. So yes, we have people from across editorial, from the product side, from the data team. It's great fun. So yes, that's another hat that I wear at the Economist.
But I mean, perhaps then, if you were thinking of a song as the soundtrack of 2022 and looking forward to 23, what would be the soundtrack for 22 and what do you expect for 23?
Well, I think we've had a couple of years where the best song was "Don't Stand So Close to Me" by the Police, and now that that's one of my favourite bands. Now that period's come to an end, I think we need to switch the playlist to "I Will Survive," in lots of different ways. But I think that would be the But also, I sort of feel one of the things Putin is trying to do is make us all give up. And stop supporting Ukraine. And he's hoping that cold winters and high energy bills in Europe will mean that Europe gives up. He's hoping that taking out all of the heating and electricity and water infrastructure in Ukraine will make Ukraine give up. And he's hoping that Donald Trump will come back in America and pull the plug on America's support for Ukraine, which is the most substantial support. And I hope he's wrong. And we all need to, collectively, we all need to do our bit. So yeah, that's the song I would choose for that reason. It's very uplifting.
Yes, and I did say to somebody recently, where is James Bond when you need him? But anyway, listen, what a delight it's been to talk to you, Tom. Thank you so much for taking the time today. And thank you so much for being a good friend to the WFA and taking time to talk to us about this fantastic publication.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been great. Thank you.
What a fantastic conversation. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And if you're going to listen to it again, you might like to slow it down because apart from being brilliant, his brain is so fast that actually he talks fast as well. But what a fantastic conversation. And again, Tom, thank you. We will start next year, by contrast, on the other side of the world with Amanda Wu, who's the CEO of AirAsia's super app. And I'm really looking forward to talking to her actually about what technology is doing to change people's lives in Asia. So meanwhile, have a very happy holidays and thanks for listening.